I've brought them in.
Sierra?
Sierra?
Hello?
Hey, how you doing, brother?
Doing good. How are you guys doing?
Not bad, not bad. What's your question, bro?
So I have played WoW and Final Fantasy off and on between the two of them, and I've noticed that WoW raids have historically been really uh, rigid in sort of the classes that excel and suffer patch per patch. And I know your favorite example of that is always Demonology Warlock, right? Um,
Yes.
and so I feel like that sort of pigeonholes people into playing classes that they might not want to play
Yeah.
if for no other reason than just to make sure that they get to do the raid.
Yes.
um, so do you think that that rigidity is a symptom of the game design and the class design, or is it more of a symptom of the player mindset where they have to perform, or maybe both?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think it's a little bit of both. So, on the one hand, Ian today in his interview with Crandor said something that made me cringe so badly, but he is so correct on it. Where he said, look, spec identity is a massive thing in WoW. 15 years ago, spec identity didn't exist, and he's not wrong. If you go back to Wrath of the Lich King, if someone asked you, what do you play? You wouldn't say Destruction Warlock or Affliction Warlock. You'd be like, Warlock. And that would be enough. The only time you would have to specify is if you were playing one of the hybrid classes, right? So if you were a tank or a healer, then you'd have to specify. Otherwise, if you're a Warlock, you're a Warlock. It doesn't really fucking matter what talent you're taking. That's up to you. You do whatever the hell you want. You're a Warlock, and that's really all that matters. These days, it's a lot more spec oriented. So people aren't just Warlocks, they're Destruction Warlocks or Demonology Warlocks or Affliction Warlocks, which immediately creates a sort of fundamental problem in that it is very rare that you will have an entire class that is just completely left out of the raid. More often, it is one or two specs that's really bad and one spec that's okay, right? So either very good or at least okay. This makes people feel like, oh my God, I'm forced to fucking switch. When in reality, if you're switching from Assassination Rogue to Subtlety Rogue, you're still a rogue, right? So you're still technically fucking playing your class, right? You're still technically going to the raid, but because you're an assassination rogue, fuck you. I don't want to play combat or subtlety. I want to be assassination, even though you're supposed to be a rogue. Now, if you look at World of Warcraft, if you compare World of Warcraft to Final Fantasy, and you look at class representation in World of Warcraft, it's fairly similar to Final Fantasy in many ways. Almost every single class has its place in every single raid. You can kind of do successful raids with mostly all of the classes in the game. It's when you start going into the specs that you start seeing some real big issues. Because this is where you can have completely dead specs. Almost every single expansion, there'll be at least 4 or 5 specs that is just dead. There's no way you can play them. They really do not work. There's specs that historically have been dead for multiple expansions in a row. The spec will just be kind of fucking meh. Now, I think it is my opinion. This is where we sort of... So this was the player psychology part of your question. Player psychology really influences that sort of belief that the game is unbalanced and the people are forced to play things that they don't necessarily want to play, even though technically speaking, as long as you're playing your class, you are playing, and that's fine. But then also, this is a result of game design as well. If you have 38 classes, and I do mean classes, because every spec in World of Warcraft is a class. When you have 38 classes, there's no fucking chance you balance all of those.
Yeah, there's going to be winners and losers with
Yeah.
38 people in the race.
Oh yeah, you can't balance all of them. It's impossible, right? It's too many. And I feel like, so on top of that, World of Warcraft makes it even harder for themselves because not only do you have 38 classes, but you also have talents for each one of those classes, which creates an even deeper problem because you have to create not only abilities for 38 classes, but then you also have to create talents for 38 classes, which now you get into some really deep shit with all the different variations of things that could happen and all the things that could go wrong and the sheer amount of stuff that you have to ultimately create just becoming an absolute ball ache. Compare this again to Final Fantasy. How many classes or jobs does Final Fantasy have?
I think it's like 19 if you count Blue Mage, 18 or 19, something like that.
Are you just jobs of war or jobs of hand as?
Yeah,
So jobs of war, it's
yeah,
19.
combat classes,
All
something
right.
like that, 18 or 19. Yeah,
Okay, let's say 18. Also, there's no talents, no talent trees, nothing like that. You play the class as it was designed to be played. You have the abilities as they're designed to be administered and as they're designed to be used. This gives the developers a reasonable expectation that they can design every single one of those jobs in such a way that all of them are viable to at least within 5% of each other, which is usually the sort of variances within Final Fantasy, is about 5% between the top and the bottom spec or class job in Final Fantasy sense. It's more manageable, I think. Is there a fix? Not an easy one, because and I don't think there is a fix, if I'm honest. Because as much as I love the job system in Final Fantasy, and believe me, I love the Black Mage. My Black Mage is just something special, and I do not ever want the Black Mage to change. I also do not want my Warlock to be a Black Mage, nor do I want my Warlock to play like a Black Mage. This is something that I fell into in the beginning, just switching to Final Fantasy. I fell into this trap of thinking, well, all of this shit is so amazing in Final Fantasy. World of Warcraft should do everything exactly like this. And then the more I thought about it and the longer I played Final Fantasy, the more I started to realize no. Final Fantasy is special because it's special, because there's something very unique and beautiful and enticing about this game. But World of Warcraft would not be special for the same reasons. World of Warcraft is special for its own reasons. And we need more of what made World of Warcraft special in the first place, not more of what makes Final Fantasy special. Because these aren't the same games. Yes, they're both MMOs and they're both technically RPGs, but they are not the same. And anyone that pretends like they're the same, I think they're doing so because they're trying to prove a point, and the point is not honesty, right? If you want to approach these honestly, you have to understand the player base is very different. The things that you want. So when I log into World of Warcraft, and I haven't done for a really long time, but when I do, I'm looking for something very specific. And it's not the same thing I'm looking for whenever I log into Final Fantasy.
yeah,
It's not the same, right? I want something from WoW. I want something completely different from Final Fantasy. And if those two start crossing, well, what do I do when I want this special thing when both of my games basically now do exactly the same thing?
right.
Right?
Yeah, that was something that I kind of struggled because, like I said, I switched back and forth between the two. Whenever we had like a talk expansion and WoW, I would go back to Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
And something I struggled with a lot in the beginning was what you're saying, where I felt like the classes in the jobs in Final Fantasy were so like distilled compared to WoW classes because
Hmm.
there's no talents, there's no choice, there's no
Yeah.
random effects on your gear. Everything is very deterministic.
Yes.
But I started to realize that like that distillation is part of the reason that they can make so much content for the game and also
Yeah.
why stuff remains relevant for so long
Yes.
because it doesn't break as
Oh
soon as
yeah.
they release something new.
Oh yeah.
Um, so I know that a lot of people are saying we should take some of these uh, classes in WoW and like parse some of these specs down. Go from 4 specs to 3 or 3 specs to 2. And I guess another part of my question is like, do you think that that would affect WoW in a similar way, where they could sort of focus down on the content more if they had less balls in the air, I guess?
No, because I think ultimately what it boils down to is Blizzard just needs to do a better job, you know? And I know that sounds so fucking silly, but Blizzard have spent the last few years, I feel, coaxing. I really do feel like Blizzard started taking their own success for granted. They fell into this thing, and really this is the fault of us, the player base. Because it doesn't matter what shit Blizzard presented us, we were okay with it. You know, we sort of swallowed it and just went on. As Balili used to say, no matter how many dicks they would put in our salad, we just eat around the dicks. It wasn't until Final Fantasy emerged, purely by accident, as a very real competitor, I think that Blizzard finally woke up and realized, whoa, well, turns out we actually have to fucking try, right? Turns out we actually have to play, like, do better, because people do have other games that they can go play. You know, I think Final Fantasy success was a massive wake-up call for Blizzard, because prior to Final Fantasy success, Blizzard didn't live in a world where anyone could challenge them. And suddenly, they were almost, like, struggling to keep up with Final Fantasy success. And I do think that was a major wake-up call for them. So I think they just need to do better. They have to be quicker in addressing player concerns. And also maybe, and this is probably the biggest thing for me, is do better at communicating to players what's going on. Because this is also very, very real. I'll oftentimes hear people say, oh my god, dead Spec. And then I go on Warcraft logs and I look at the specs, and the spec is within 2% variance. The spec's not doing badly. In fact, the spec is perfectly fine. It's not top, but it is perfectly fine. And this, to me, suggests that Blizzard is doing a really piss poor job of communicating what they want from each spec, what the strengths and weaknesses of specs are supposed to be, and doubling down on those strengths and weaknesses, right? Ensuring that people know that, hey, this spec is really good at this, but not necessarily as great at this, or that. Because once players know that, it becomes easier to accept the fact that, hey, you know, I'm not going to be top on this fight, but the fact that I'm in the middle of the pack, considering that I'm actually not playing the best spec for this fight, is pretty good, you know, and I'm pretty happy with being in this position. It's gonna take more. Blizzard will have to, and I don't know how Blizzard's gonna fix this. Sadly, this is one of the reasons I'm so against logging in Final Fantasy, and I will always be against logging, because I saw the sort of evolution of World of Warcraft from being just a game that people played and people trying out different things in order to figure out what works, to a game that is all about the log. Like, the log is everything. And I sometimes feel like, why should if you are killing the fucking boss, your logs don't matter.
I mean, a win's a win.
Yeah, you killed the fucking... What, did you want to kill it faster? Like, it's dead, right? You can't dead it more dead. It's dead as dead can be. Therefore, the logs are completely useless at this point, other than the fact that you want to see how big your dick is. And if that is what you want to do, you know, kudos to you, go for it. But it shouldn't matter. But for some reason, it does matter to players. They're like, oh my god, my spec's dead. Dude, you're 11 out of 12 heroic. Your spec's fine. What? You think your spec's going to do better and you're suddenly going to turn into a mythic raider? No, your spec's fine. You've killed 11 of the fucking 12 bosses. Just work a little harder, you'll get the 12th one. It's no problem, right? Of course, this goes without saying, there are truly broken specs out there. But I think a lot of the time it is just players sort of... Like, look, if you're not top, you're broken, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that also just last little quick thought was I
Mhm.
had with the profession overhaul that's coming into Dragonflight. Do you think that we might see a heavier emphasis placed on some of those systems in professions? Like, we're going back to like much stronger enchants or like scrolls or some other modifiers that might help people sort of break out of that meta slave mindset where if I'm not first, I'm last. Is there any universe you see where they might find a way to sort of edge that 2% closer?
Um, yeah, that's a very difficult question because I don't think that's a solvable thing. I think one of the things that will definitely help alleviate that is more casual content. Those people that don't necessarily like raiding in general, giving them things to do that isn't raiding will already help a lot to alleviate some of those problems. Where, you know, you sort of make the raiding scene less competitive from a numbers perspective so that raiders have spots to raid, feel a lot safer to raid, and don't feel as under threat when they're raiding. And then casuals don't feel like they have to protrude or exist in this space that they don't necessarily want to exist in. Could probably have some effect. I don't know. From the professions side of things, in terms of scrolls and stuff, I don't think that would help because anything that provides any sort of buff or any sort of competitive advantage isn't just optional ever, right? And I'm very
Yeah,
hesitant for Blizzard to release anything into the game that is sort of like, oh, this is an optional power boost. In WoW, there's no such thing as optional power boosts.
right. It
If
just
it's a
becomes World Buffs Part 2.
Exactly. If it's a fucking power boost, suddenly your guild master that is running a guild that's 10 out of fucking 11 normal forces everyone to grind 9 hours a day because everyone must have their extra buff. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to kill the boss. And it's like, dude, you're not method. You guys are struggling on normal. I promise you that extra buff is not going to be the fucking difference between winning and losing. You're struggling
Right.
on normal. There's a bunch of other issues there. But sadly, you're asking a very difficult question, and I wish I had a better answer for you. I'm just glad I'm not Ian Azikostas because he's the guy that has to solve this issue, and I have no fucking clue how you do that.
Yeah, it seems like a nightmare.
Yes, absolutely. Do you have any other questions that you wanted to ask or anything that you wanted to add?
No, that was pretty much it. Just wanted to talk about that.
Thank you very much for the questioning, Sierra. Really appreciate
Absolutely, man.
that. Take
No
care of
problem. You have a
yourself,
good one.
brother.
You too.
All right. Peace.